Let's review TerraMaster F4-423, their high-performance 4-bay NAS. This is ArtIsRight. Before we start, subscribe if you're new and hit on the bell icon so you'll be notified every time I upload cool new videos like this. Full disclosure, TerraMaster sent me this NAS to do review and testing. All the opinions you're about to hear are going to be my own. You may have seen that I have done an extensive review and testing on their DAS unit as well, so the first thing we're going to do is give you a quick overview, the difference between a NAS and a DAS. And then afterwards we'll talk about the hardware, software, performance, and I'll do a comparison of this device with some of the other ones that are on the market, or what I think, how does this device perform relative to those. Let's start out with a quick overview, the difference between a NAS, network attached storage, versus a DAS, direct attached storage. A NAS is a standalone device, and you can just pretty much use it as is. The first time you set it up, you're going to need a computer, but from that point on, you are pretty much good to go. A DAS is computer dependent. In order to access files on here, you're going to need your computer. When it comes to accessing the file, they can just go through the system browser and just use the OS itself to access files on here without any problem whatsoever. When it comes to a DAS, it's not quite as simple. You need to install the software so that the system would boot up and you can access the files that are on these devices. So the thing is this, with Windows, you have to install software that will boot up your system. On Mac, you need to install what they call a kernel extension, and you also need to lower the OS security level in order for that kernel extension to boot with the OS, in order for Mac OS to pretty much see the files that are linked up on this device, and for the OS to see the drives that are in here. Now, in addition to that, because this has a RAID system and it has a hardware RAID, you can choose to use either the hardware RAID or the software RAID. If you use the software RAID, those are going to be RAID that are generated from either Windows or from Mac OS, for instance. But if you want to use their hardware RAID, you also need to install a separate RAID software. In general, these software are going to be from the chipset manufacturer for the hardware RAID, and they're not going to be quite as polished as, for example, an integrated OS on a NAS that also will take care of the RAID for you. So those are just some of the things to really think about when you're really trying to access this, and also the setup. The other thing that we need to consider when it comes to these devices as well is the speed. When it comes to a NAS, the maximum speed you're going to be able to get on this one is going to be limited by the Ethernet port on the device. Whereas, for instance, on a DAS, well, pretty much because you're either using Thunderbolt or USB direct connection, you're going to get a much higher speed on these DAS devices. Essentially, the best thing to think about is that, for instance, if you have a studio, a NAS is a good thing to set up in a studio so that everyone can access the file. It is in the stationary position. However, a DAS is something that you can take on location with you to a shoot, and you can plug this into different computers provided that you have installed the software properly. Now, the modal for access is one of the main differences between these as well. For example, this is a standalone device that allows multiple access, meaning that any user with the right credential can access files on here. So this is really more of like a group sharing, acting like a server. Files on a DAS are more single access. This is really for one user to access the content. And granted, you can share a file and folder on a network. However, if that computer is off, the files and folders that are shared are no longer going to be available to other computers on a network. So you need to leave two devices on versus one. That's something to think about. The other thing that you can also do on a NAS is set up a media server. For example, you can use either Plex or MB. You can set this up, have the content on here, and have this stream to multiple different devices. This is something that you can't really do on a DAS because it doesn't really handle any of the operating system or the software. It just stores the data. So you're still relying on the computer OS to run those software to really distribute the content. So those are just some of the things to think about. Now, when it comes to the RAID itself, I mentioned this already, that the OS for the NAS itself integrates RAID pretty much right into it, and is really polished, it's really clean, it's really easy to use. And the other thing I really like about that is it gives you a lot of information about the RAID system that you have, whether it's degraded, whatever that may be. When it comes to this, as I mentioned before, you're using the chipset software, and it's not really the most verbose way of really seeing your data. All right, now that we have done a quick comparison, let's quickly talk about the F4-423. This is their top-of-the-line 4-bay NAS that they have. There is no expansion with this one, no expansion slot whatsoever. So the thing is this is a really solidly built NAS. The only difference between this NAS and the DAS itself is just the handle on top. This is designed to move around. This one is designed to be stationary. And regarding the similar design between these two devices, it is a good and a bad thing. and we'll talk more about that later. So the front of the device and also the back, it's pretty much just plastic with the aluminum chassis in the middle. This is a very strong solid aluminum core that help also to dissipate heat as well. Now, the one thing that I will also point out about this NAS on the exterior before we talk about anything else is that they come with these rubber silicone feet, as you see right now, and these feet comes off very easily. You can see that one is already gone. This is really good to reduce vibration from the drive onto whatever surface you have this device on. However, they do fall off easily, and in a box, they do come with the replacement parts, but in general, I don't really use these as much, and I tend to go in and just pull them out. And in favor of these silicone devices, I end up using these felt pads on the bottom of the device instead. So they're a little bit flatter. They don't absorb the vibration as much as these ones, but they don't fall off quite as easily either. So that's something to think about if you want to modify this a little bit. All right. With that being said, inside this NAS itself is an Intel Celeron N5095, which is in many cases 30 to 50% faster than the competitor NAS are out there. So they do go in and pack a little bit more computing power in this NAS. It does have hardware encoding. If you want to use this as a media server, you can certainly do that. It comes with 4 gigabytes of memory in a single SODIMM non-ECC memory that is upgradable to 32 gigabytes of memory should you want to do that. You can, but it is not quite as easy to do. There are 2 NVMe slots in an undisclosed location. In the front of the device, there are 4 drive bays. These are pretty much just plastic drive bays, and the front of it is not even spring-loaded. It's pretty much just mechanical. You insert your finger in there, and you just lift it up to pull the drive bay out. The nice thing is that it does come with quick mount for full-size hard drives, so it does have these tabs. You can quickly just put the hard drive in there, snap these in, and pretty much put them into place. Now, if you're using, for example, 2.5-inch SSDs, they do come with screws as part of the kit that you can just screw them in and still use these bays or these caddy for that without any issues whatsoever. In the front of the device, beyond just the 4 bays, you have the indicator for the drive. There is pretty much a network light indicator, the power light, and also then there's a power button. Below that is just a model number, and that's really the only difference on the front between the NAS versus the DAS, and the fact that this has like 1 more bay, but we're not going to think about that much. So on the back of this device, it has an HDMI connection right there. Now, I did try to plug in an HDMI cord. When it's booting up, it's like a computer, a PC booting up. So it tells you the motherboard is telling you what is loading. For example, like is using BTRFS, is loading the RAID system, all these things. So it's just like booting it up. But once it boots into TOS, that is the software that runs on here, the operating system, well, you don't get the output from HDMI anymore. So that's really more for like diagnostic for their technician per se. I don't think it's actually any use to the user overall. It's very interesting that they actually put that there. Below that are 2 USB 3.1, 10 gigabits per second. This is really designed so you can plug in periphery, or the other thing that you can do is plug in a hard drive or SSD and copy the file directly over. So that's another thing that you can do on these devices. And right below that are dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet connection, which is the most forward-looking feature of this NAS. Do note that your switch and networking card in your computer needs to support these kind of speed, because if it doesn't, well, then you might have to go and upgrade all these equipment before you can really actualize the speed that's available from this device. So the benefit of this may not be apparent right away. However, it is there in the future should you need it. These ports can be link aggregated, but remember that your switch have to support link aggregation. And the other thing too is that, for instance, if your computer has a 10 gigabit Ethernet connection, just because you aggregate these together, it doesn't mean that your computer is going to access this NAS at 5 gigabits per second. It's not really designed that way. It's designed for multiple computers to access these ports at the full 2.5. So something to think about there. Right underneath that is a power barrel type connector that you see here. And I do appreciate TerraMaster putting a little sticker on their device that makes it easy to identify. I really like that. And I would say this, I wish that not just only TerraMaster, but other brands as well would just stop using these generic parts bin that has these generic namings and branding on the back of these things, and just put your branding on there. Put a sticker with the word TerraMaster on there so that I know that this is the one that goes with TerraMaster device. I would say though that having the TerraMaster sticker like on the cord itself is a step forward, but I want more from this. Either that or just do the plastic injected mold with the, your logo on the device. There's nothing wrong with that. Now let's move on to memory and NVMe upgrade. So I don't know where they are, and there's no written support documentation. I have to reach out to their support chat to find out where these things are, to which they sent me a link to a YouTube video, which is great because I really get to see a visual demonstration of what I need to do. However, I also think that a written documentation is absolutely necessary, and it wasn't really there. And also, this is where the similarity that I mentioned earlier to the NAS is a downside, because it's using the same parts. In the front is using the same parts, in the back is using the same chassis, but it also makes it very difficult to install and upgrade RAM on the system. So in order to do that, there's a few things that you have to note. First, I'll pop these drive out. And the first place that I look for these NVMe slots was pretty much inside the array itself. Well, inside here, there are no slots for NVMe whatsoever. So what about on the bottom? Pretty much it is a solid piece of stainless steel metal right there if you don't have anything. So in order for you to really access the board itself to install any RAM upgrade or install the NVMe, you have to pretty much unscrew these 6 screws from the back, take this out, unplug 2 cables for each of these fans, and then afterwards you have to slide this aluminum chassis up. And this is where I say the similarity starts to really end, where it now becomes a detriment for me to do this, because they're using the same parts, which is great. However, it doesn't make it easy for me. What I would love to see is an access for NVMe inside the device itself and memory on the bottom as a cover or something, or just do both of these on the bottom, or cut a little opening on the side here so that users can access this. One more thing that I also wanted to point out about the memory as well is that there is one open slot on this side of the board. However, if you want to upgrade both memory up to 32 gigabytes, well, you have to really wiggle the other memory stick from the other side of the board, which is also kind of like sandwiched in between the chassis. It's really, I wouldn't say the most well thought out like for upgrading. That's when it comes to this NAS. Now, the other thing that I also want to point out is memory compatibility. So I was asking them which memory is compatible with this, to which they sent me to a support page. And the only thing on that support page are all TerraMaster memory. And I understand that, it makes it easier for the company, and many companies are now doing this, where if you use their own memory, it makes it easy for them to support because you're not using third-party memory. But also at the very same time, I see memory as one of those basic components in computers. And unless you're integrating them in with a chip like the way how Apple's doing it, I would say just allow us to use generic memory. List the minimum specifications so we can get those. And if we want to choose to buy a third-party brand, we can. And if we want to go with TerraMaster, we can do that. All right. Now let's talk about NVMe. So inside this NAS, I have installed 2 512 gigabyte Samsung 970 EVO Plus NVMe. And in RAID 0, I'm supposed to get around like 1 terabyte of storage. In RAID 1, which is a mirrored, I'm supposed to get 512 gigabytes. So how much is the system really seeing that? Well, in TOS itself, this is the TerraMaster Operating System, it sees much less than this. So I was perplexed by the fact that I can't use the full NVMe capacity on the system. So then I reached out to their support chat, to which they have to talk to the engineer first, and they came up with a few things. So there are 3 criteria to really figure out how much NVMe space is going to be available. So number 1, the NVMe, the SSD size itself is going to be the limiting factor, which in this case, 2512 is not the limiting factor. I'm getting to see about like half of this. The volume size itself, these are 10 terabyte Iron Wolf drive, so that's definitely not the problem there. And then what they sent me, the last thing, is a complex mathematical formula called a maximum cache capacity allowed to create by the amount of RAM in the system. Now, I'm not certain if this is a software, a TOS limitation, that's their operating system, or a hardware limitation of the system. This is something that they did not share with me. So I would say that what I've just gone over here are probably the most convoluted part of this NAS. It is a great hardware, but it definitely does need polishing. Now let's talk about TOS, or TerraMaster OS, Because I'm using Iron Wolf drive, the nice part about this is within Storage Manager and TOS, there is a dedicated panel for Iron Wolf that integrates right in. If you use another brand hard drive, it'll just be smart information. That's just something to note. I just find that really cool. The setup was easy, but with minor glitches. For example, when I tried to like relink my browser to the device after the software download, it didn't really go right away. They make you go through like their website for like setting up, and you have to give them the email. It's just like these little things that I wish it was a little bit more straightforward. It's not a bad experience per se, but it's also one too where I think many of us will be wondering like, hey, I just buy your device. Why are you asking me for my email to send this documentation over? It's just more data collection in some senses. So the one nice thing about setting this up that I will say is that it does give you a GUI graphical interface showing the different capacity for different RAID type, and that's what I really like. So there's no guessing or just dialing each different RAID type. It shows you right then and there how much space you are getting with this, and that's something that I really like about this one. In my testing during the initial setup, there is really no way to bypass the hard drive scanning. When you set up a NAS normally, or any type of RAID, normally they would do the initialization, that when it scans all the drive to make sure there's no error, to map everything out. This is good for anyone to do, and I'm glad that they actually make you do this. However, for me, I'm doing a lot of these testings, so I'm taking these known good drive, popping them in and out of different NAS, and I want to be able to skip this part, and it's something that I can't do. So a little annoying there that I want to point out. So they have been at this for quite some time now. Their software is in version 5. It is good, it is stable, but it does need polishing. Beside the fact that things are grouped together differently than other NAS OS, for instance, I mean, just even looking past that part, there are things that I would say just are not quite as straightforward. So for instance, I intentionally crashed the array by swapping out one of the drive while it is off to a brand new Seagate Iron Wolf drive. And when I log back in, well, the system started beeping. I log into the OS, it pops up with a notification saying that the array has been downgraded. Not degraded, downgraded. So there are some phrasing that are a little bit off, and when you click on that, it doesn't really take you to the Storage Manager right away. So when I go into Storage Manager, it shows that it is now degraded, which is the proper term that they want to use. However, it took me a while to find out where do I click to repair this array, because it is not quite as straightforward. There is a button there saying repair this array now because you have already replaced a drive, or that a new drive has been detected. It doesn't do any of those things. So after a while, clicking around different things, I'm able to pretty much do the repair on the RAID. The other thing that I also find annoying as well is that there's not a clear and easy way for you to go in and disable the beeping. So I was doing all that while the NAS is constantly like beeping like every few seconds or so. It can be really annoying. I can't remember exactly what I did to disable the beeping, but there is a way to do that, but not the most intuitive way to find things. On the plus side of this NAS in general and the operating system, there is a feature that I think is a star to show, and that is called T-RAID. So T-RAID is very similar to Synology Hybrid RAID or SHR, and this allows you to build a hard drive array using all hard drives of different sizes. Now, it's generally not recommended that you really go out and build something like that, but if you want to be more on the economical side of things and really utilize the drive that you already have in your inventory, that's one great way of doing it. And it also gives you flexibility upgrading drives in the future as well. For instance, you can upgrade to like a larger drive, and it will also incorporate all those capacity in. A lot of flexibility, not necessarily the best for performance, but again, this is not really going to be the, I would say, mission critical NAS anyway, so I think you're going to be okay with that. So to give us an example, in a traditional RAID, say I have two drives that's 10 terabyte and two drives that's 12 terabyte. If I put them all together using a traditional RAID, the RAID itself is going to treat all those drives, even the 12 terabyte one, as 10 terabyte drive. With T-RAID, it allows me to go in and utilize all those space, so it will treat the 210 as 10, but it will treat the 212 terabyte as 12 terabyte drive and combine all those space together, which is great. So the one thing that I do want to point out is that when you're using these type of RAID, remember that these are proprietary RAID, and your mileage will definitely vary when it comes to data recovery. And this is also why having a backup system for your NAS is really important. Remember that redundancy on these things is really there to reduce any downtime with your workflow. It is not a backup solution, and you still need a backup for these NAS. Now that we have talked about the operating system, let's shift gear and talk about the performance. As far as read and write goes, I was able to link this up to my 10 gigabit Ethernet switch, and in my testing, I'm able to sustain close to 250 megabytes per second mark. That is pretty much right where it needs to be for a 2.5 gigabits per second speed connection. So it does get the speed without any issues whatsoever. It also has hardware encoder built in for video transcoding. So for instance, let's say you use Plex or MB and you want to stream to other devices that are, requires video in lower resolution, you can certainly do it on this device, and it does have enough power for that. So how does this NAS compare to the competitors? Well, one thing I will say is that it has really forward-thinking I/O. The dual 2.5 gigabit Ethernet connection is something that you don't see on many of this level NAS out there right now. It may require that you do some infrastructure upgrade to maximize full potential, but nonetheless, that potential is there. There's no doubt that the hardware quality that I've gone over so far is really of great quality. It is solidly built. There are just some quirks with the RAM and NVMe upgrade, and the fact that there's no written documentation on it that, just really gets me a little bit. But that is something that TerraMaster can easily resolve those by just creating those documentation, uploading it on your website, and you are pretty much good to go. One can argue that upgrading the RAM and NVMe SSD is a once or twice thing in the lifetime of this device. You don't have to do that so often, so having to take the device apart is okay. I still like to have a better way to really do that. And the other thing that I also want to point out is that the NVMe SSD size utilization within TOS, or like I said, I don't know if it's the OS limitation or the hardware limitation, but I would love for them to just put that as a documentation on their website so I can search that easily instead of having to find out from the OS itself after putting in 512 gigabytes in there that I can't really utilize the full potential of 2 of those inside my NAS. The OS does offer a lot of nice features, and I would say that T-RAID is really the star of the show for TOS. The overall OS is stable. Everything works fine, but some things may not be as intuitive as you'd like it to be, and there are improvements that they can definitely do, and they are releasing updates with improvement, and that's something that I really love to see. Where it stands now, price-wise, you would get really great I/Os with this device. You would get more power on the chip compared to what is available to the competitor, and if you can live with a good OS with some unintuitive features that can improve over time and be polished, I think that you have a solid NAS contender on the market that you may want to look at. So anyway, I hope that you find this helpful. If you have any questions or comment, leave them below. Give this a like, subscribe, and hit the bell if you're new, and in Art we trust.